I worked at Cuddyback AGGR in 1980 and Superior Valley AGGR from 1981 to 1985. AGGR is abbreviated for Air Ground Gunnery Range. The Superior Valley location was actually the China Lake Naval Weapons Center. The Air Force operated it through 1983 and Lockheed took over operations in 1984. I was, of course, employed by Lockheed from 84 to 85. I've got a couple of pictures I'm going to show you next. The first, of course, is it's a map picture. It shows where the range was located at. The big red circle out there. You can always go out there and zoom in with Google Maps and see it the way it looks today. But anyway, it shows the China Lake Naval Range, and it shows George Air Force Base where we were stationed. That's where we were stationed. That's where we worked. Anyway, the second picture is the really important one. It gives you a reference. Seeing something is understanding something. The picture immediately shows you how close those target areas were to our compound. From the first day that they started using depleted uranium out here and those pits turned into, you know, this grinder, okay, of munitions, okay, every flight that came through and hit those areas, okay, with strafe ammo would kick dust, dirt, and particulates up into the air. And that's where the contamination out there came from. Seeing it in the picture, I mean, it's really, really, really obvious. And it's not just the depleted uranium. I mean, munitions have a lot of heavy metals in them. So you've got, you know, heavy metal particles of different compounds, stuff like cobalt, nickel, lead, iron, you know what I mean? Those are just to name a few. And you know, all this stuff goes up in the air and it ends up dumping onto the compound, and you've got people that are breathing this stuff in. I mean, on a daily basis. I mean, think about it. All day long, okay, you've got strafe missions out here that are hitting those areas. And so you've got a lot of dust and dirt out there. They made, I believe, a huge mistake when they put this place together like this with those targets that close and started using radioactive munitions out there. I mean, this was just a really, really, really bad idea. And especially from an exposure point of view and for the folks that worked out here, and especially the folks that worked on, you know, were out there on a regular basis. Anyway, that's the picture. That's what it looked like back then. And moving forward. Before starting this, I want to mention the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. What makes the EPA important with all of this is they know what was contaminated and where it was contaminated. They have a site called Radtown, which is for radioactivity, and in that section, of course, is the depleted uranium. And they have a warning in there against exposure on firing ranges. You know, and the reason they put that in there is because these places were very, very, very toxic. I mean, there was a lot of contamination on these places. Yet when you go hit the VA site, you will find absolutely no mention at all about firing ranges and veterans that work there. So first off, what were we exposed to? Well, let's start off with obviously depleted uranium. Secondly was heavy metals used in munitions, stuff like cobalt, nickel, iron, lead, etc. Toxic smoke from range fires, radioactive burn pits, dust and particles. I mean, this is a desert environment. And so how were we exposed? How did this stuff get inside of our bodies? Well, of course, you know, inhalation, you inhale it. You ingest it, ends up in your food, you end up in your mouth when parts of it gets ingested when you breathe it in. And dermal contact, it gets on our skin. Okay, so now we know how, you know, the exposure occurs, how it actually gets in your body. So how do we quantify the amount of exposure? Here's where fact meets speculation. The Lockheed cleanup out there, they cleaned up roughly 25,000 pounds of depleted uranium fragments when they did the cleanup. Now, part of those rounds when they were originally fired, okay, when they hit the targets, when they hit other rounds, they became aerosolized. Part of those rounds were ground down into smaller particles. I mean, they're shooting these rounds into traps. Part of those rounds got ignited. Okay, depleted uranium does ignite and then turns into fine particulates. My own estimate on this is there's probably at least 2 to 3 times what was actually cleaned up, if not more, is what they actually probably used out there. So, and again, it's something we won't know because, you know, the government's not going to tell you what they did out there. Their job in all this is to minimize it and try to make it go away. Did we know they were using depleted uranium? Absolutely. We had EOD briefings on munitions. I mean, you cannot work at a gunnery range without getting briefed on the munitions that are out there. A gunnery range is a pretty dangerous place. Anyway, we had soldiers out there taking depleted uranium ammo home as souvenirs. We had spent depleted uranium ammo on our windowsills. I mean, this was, you know, it was cool. It was, you know, it was what it was. And keep in mind, we were told at that time this stuff was safe. You know what I mean? There was no hazard with it. And that was the mindset back then. Did we use any safety equipment? No, nothing was used out there. No respirators or protective clothing. We pretty much went out in our regular military greens and did our work that way, just boots and our clothing. Pretty much standard fare. The description of the gunnery range operations, partly what I remember from that time period combined with what we know about depleted uranium and heavy metal contamination at this point. So I'm taking the two parts and I'm putting them together to give you an idea of where I think the contamination occurred. You know, I've got meteorological background here and a little bit of a science background. Anyway, moving forward, the pits. The pits were 2 traps that they used for strafing. Each trap had 2 telephone poles on each side. And they had a painted drag chute suspended between the poles, and the rounds hitting that target were electronically scored by the main tower. So this is what they were shooting at. And these targets were right around 4/10 of a mile away from our compound. So they're close. Flight after flight would come in and shoot at the targets. As I already mentioned, the targets were pretty close. When a depleted uranium round strikes a target, part of it aerosolizes into very small particles. These particles can then be carried on the winds and spread for many miles. When a round strikes the traps, a plume of dirt and particulates is ejected into the air. You know, planes are coming in strafing, they're strafing these target areas, okay, and of course, dirt and dust and particles are all being thrown right up into the air. The traps are full of both DU, depleted uranium, and conventional target ammo. The issue with that is when you have incoming rounds striking rounds that are not moving. It turns the traps into a giant churning contaminated mess of aerosolized particles and fragments. Once that area is contaminated, any flight that comes through and shoots at that area ends up taking that depleted uranium contamination and spreading it around. So all day long, okay, you have flight after flight hitting these targets and nothing but contamination coming out of them because you've already contaminated them with depleted uranium. Once particulates are airborne, they are carried aloft by the winds. So you've got all this dust and dirt that's being kicked up. If the winds are blowing that day and it's a desert environment, you've got this stuff going into the air all day long. If the winds that day were blowing towards our compound, the contamination, of course, was dumped on us. You know, I was a range meteorologist out there, so I was well aware of toxic order calculations and our level of exposure. I mean, think about it. All day long, flight after flight, hitting these targets, putting the stuff up in the air, and you're downwind from it. You know what I mean? It's like you're going to get pounded with this stuff. Contaminated dust and dirt that has settled over the compound can become resuspended in the air from vehicles and foot traffic. This furthers contamination, and of course the inhalation and ingestion process continues. I mean, think about it. The stuff that's being dropped all over the compound is now being recirculated every time a vehicle walks through the dust and the dirt. And every time foot traffic, you know, someone's walking through there, it's on their clothes, it's on the vehicles. Anyway, the contamination process just continues right along. Contaminated dust is also carried into the compound itself by doors opening, wind and foot traffic on clothes and boots. Once it's in the building, it ends up being resuspended and circulated by the air conditioning system. Food and drink becomes contaminated. I mean, inhalation is obvious. We had big bays on the side where we had vehicles, and these were connected to the main building, and we had air conditioning out there. It was part of the system. So, again, it's all intertwined. Vehicles become contaminated. Dust is again continually resuspended by air conditioning inside the vehicles. I mean, again, it's a desert environment. You get dust, dirt, and you get, of course, contaminated dust and dirt in there. You got the air conditioning system running, heating. You're blowing the stuff around the vehicle, and of course, you're inhaling it. The main compound was the primary source of contamination, at least for me. I mean, this is where I spent most of my time. Heavy equipment routinely brought contamination to the compound. Targets were welded and repairs done at the compound. Vehicle and foot traffic continuously resuspended contaminated dust and particles. The use of air conditioning, heating ensured contamination was continuously resuspended in the air. Range cleanup. This was probably one of the more unpleasant tasks we had to do while I was working out there. We all had to basically do it. You walk the pit areas, pick up spent ammunition, walk the bomb target circles, and pick up expended practice bombs. The big thing here is this area is contaminated. I mean, this is, a contaminated area, and you're walking around doing manual labor in it. And you're not wearing any protective gear. You're picking up munitions off the ground. You're kicking up dirt, dust, and, whatever else is out there, and you're breathing that stuff in. The burn trenches. First off, the VA would have you believe, okay, that, these things were something that were, invented, okay, in the 1990s going forward. But, this has been standard military practice for years. All our compound trash, bombs, and dredged ammo was taken out to the trenches that had been dug for that purpose. The material was then set on fire and later covered up. Being the person or persons tasked with having to watch it burn was always unpleasant. Imagine depleted uranium, contaminated trash, set on fire, and this again created more toxic corridors. It burned, it spread the contamination. And this, of course, is where we have our radioactive burn pits, because that's what happens when you take radioactive material and you light it on fire, and, you end up with a radioactive burn pit. Here we have range fires. This was probably the worst duty I ever performed while I was in the Air Force. If ordnance out there sets off a fire, everyone becomes firefighters. Firefighting consists of heading out with a backpack, a water pump, and a shovel. You got no protective gear. If it took you all night or all day to put it out, you were putting it out. And the way fires out there were generated was usually one of two ways. Usually either a practice bomb, went off target and ended up lighting the desert on fire out there. Or the strafe pits, you would get what we called hot fragments. They were usually depleted uranium, that was on fire and would get ejected from that pit. And if it happened to hit brush or something, you had a fire. Now, the other big problem was that with that is if you had flights up in the air, we had to wait and let it burn until the range was clear. And so by this time, you've got a pretty good fire going out there. And like I said, it's very, very, very unpleasant sitting out there and, working in that kind of environment without any protection, putting fires out. Last up here, on the contamination list here is the vehicle graveyard. About 100 feet or so away from our main compound sat the vehicle graveyard. These were target vehicles, armor. Many of these have been used on the range, contaminated with DU. This again was just another, source of contamination. It's sitting right next to the compound. All right, these are my closing thoughts. Anyway, this was my little presentation of, how I thought the veterans that worked in these places were exposed to the munitions that were used during that time. There's veterans not just at the range I was at, but there's veterans throughout that time period that worked at proving grounds, that worked at these different locations. And I think the VA owes, those individuals you know, at least something here. Those of us that had health issues out of working these places should have been taken care of. I mean, this should not be something 35 years later I'm sitting here fighting for, or someone else is fighting for. I mean, these ranges were not, you know, not exactly the cleanest place to work at. I spent, you know, roughly 5 years out at these places, and who knows what all I breathed in and how much. It's hard to tell, and, you know, after the fact. But anyway, those were my closing thoughts on this. Again, if anyone out there can help fight these guys, okay, because they pretty much, you know, the VA has eradicated us. You know, we, as far as they're concerned, we do not exist. You know, that entire 1980s period, completely eliminated. You know what I mean? There's nothing here for us. So anyway, I'm going to continue my fight with them, and maybe one of these days, okay, this will actually come to some kind of fruition. Anyway, thanks for watching the video.